You think the grand palaces of Venice stand on solid rock. They do not. Every massive stone church in this lagoon is actually balanced on millions of ancient, waterlogged tree trunks driven deep into the slime. But wood rots. Normally, a pine log left in water decays within a decade. Yet these wooden foundations have supported Venice for over 1,500 years. The secret lies in the mud. This story began in the middle of the 5th century. In 452, families watched their homes burn as invaders swept across northern Italy. The refugees fled to the nearest marshland. It was a hostile swamp of thick mud and malaria. There was no dry land. But the water provided safety. The invaders had horses and heavy iron weapons, but they couldn't cross the shallow, treacherous tides. The refugees stayed. They built simple huts on the low mud flats. They survived by harvesting salt and catching fish. As the years passed, the settlement grew. In 568, another wave of refugees arrived, fleeing the Lombards. These people needed permanent homes, but the soft mud couldn't support the weight of heavy stone buildings. If they built directly on the silt, the buildings would sink into the lagoon. They turned to the forest. To build a foundation, they drove millions of wooden piles deep into the ground. They used trees like oak and larch. These logs were harvested from the forests of Croatia and Slovenia. Workers floated the timber down the Adriatic Sea to the lagoon. Then they hammered them in by hand. They drove the piles through the loose mud and sand. They didn't stop until the wood hit a layer of tough, compact clay called caranto. This clay layer lies deep beneath the lagoon floor. Once the piles were firmly embedded in the clay, workers cut them flat at the water level. They laid thick wooden planks on top of the piles. On top of the planks, they placed blocks of Istrian stone. This stone is highly resistant to water. Only then did they begin building the brick walls. This solved the sinking problem, but it created an even bigger danger. Thousands of buildings were now resting on wet wood. If the wood rotted, the entire city would collapse into the water. Yet the wood did not rot. Normally, fungi and bacteria eat wood and break it down. But these organisms need oxygen to survive. The lagoon mud is different. The silt is dense and completely lacks oxygen. Because the piles were driven deep into this anaerobic silt, they were cut off from the air. The wood was locked in a giant, natural preservation chamber. Over the centuries, the wood underwent a transformation. The flowing tides carried minerals that slowly seeped into the timber. The wood absorbed these minerals, becoming extremely hard over time. Instead of weakening, the foundations grew stronger. This is where most builders would celebrate their success. They couldn't. A city built on water is a city at war with chemistry. The mud preserved the foundations, but the water above was actively destroying the brickwork. Salt water is a quiet, relentless enemy. As the tides rise and fall, water seeps into the porous bricks of the buildings. The water evaporates, leaving behind tiny salt crystals. These crystals grow inside the brick. As they expand, they shatter the clay from the inside out. If left alone, the bottom of every building would crumble into powder. To stop this, Venetians had to invent a new way of building. They placed a layer of impermeable stone just above the high tide line. This blocked the salt water from rising into the red brick walls. But the water had other ways to attack: erosion. The tides themselves are constantly moving, carrying silt out to sea. If the currents washed away too much mud, the wooden piles would be exposed to oxygen. Even a brief exposure to the air would start the rotting process. To prevent this, the city created a powerful government agency in 1501. It was called the Magistrato alle. Their job was simple: protect the lagoon at all costs. They diverted entire rivers. They redirected the Brenta and Piave rivers directly into the sea to prevent mud from silting up the lagoon. They built massive stone seawalls called marshes. For 500 years, this agency held back the natural forces of the earth. They treated the lagoon as a living machine. They knew that if the mud washed away, wood-eating shipworms would devour the exposed timber. If the rivers dumped too much sediment, the lagoon would turn into dry land, leaving Venice vulnerable to land invasions. If the sea broke through, the violent waves would tear the buildings apart. The balance had to be perfect. Today, the Magistrato alle is gone, but the battle continues. Venice faces a new set of threats. The sea level is rising, and the city itself is sinking. Groundwater extraction in the 20th century caused the land to settle by nearly 24 centimeters. To combat this, engineers built a massive system of mobile barriers called MOSE. These barriers rise from the seafloor during high tides to block the sea. But MOSE only protects against floods. It does not stop the slow, chemical decay of the brickwork. It does not repair the ancient wood beneath the surface. Engineers must constantly inspect the foundations. They use specialized drills to test the strength of the medieval piles. When a building begins to tilt, they must pump grout into the soil or replace the damaged timber. It is a silent, endless cycle of maintenance. The city survives only because of this continuous effort. Without the work of these modern engineers, the ancient forest supporting Venice would finally collapse. Venice remains a monument to human persistence, balanced precariously on a hidden forest in the mud. Which ancient engineering marvel do you believe is most vulnerable to the modern climate?